Thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'm excited to open up the AI track. So let's jump into a little bit of, how I got here. I'm originally from Chicago and went to AU, Aurora University in Illinois, the home of Wayne and Garth. And after I graduated there, I spent 2 years at rollingstone.com during the internet boom, learning how to do online commerce and podcasting before podcasting was a thing. And then I managed to get into Microsoft in '99, right before Y2K. And I was doing a whole bunch of app dev consulting at the time, and so I got a lot of engineering experience. Then I had kids in about 2006, and I decided to no longer travel. I needed to go find a desk job, and so I ended up in MSIT, where I ended up specifically in security and doing security operations and doing malware and then doing DLP and then becoming the chief of staff, where they gave me the name El Jefe. And so that's where it stuck. And then in about 2017, well, November of 2016, I was like, you know what? I've run the gambit. I've already done everything in security. What else is there? And so there was this role in research, and that's where I went, and I joined Microsoft Research, the technology and research division. And now I just hack things, right? But the interesting thing is, like, when I first joined in 2017, one of the first things I did in that January 2017 is I sat down with this program manager and this developer, and they tried to describe this project where they wanted to bring a bot onto social media and have her pretend that it was a young teenage woman and see how it would interact with the general population. And so my first question was, are you high? And then I started going in and digging deep, and I was like, what exactly are you trying to do, and what is this thing? And they were saying these things like LLM and large language and models and chat. And in 2017, I really didn't get it, right? I mean, yeah, I did all this stuff around security, but this was an entirely different thing that I really had to get my head wrapped around. And then we launched it. And everybody knows what happened with the Taybot and how it went rampant and started causing a whole bunch of really negative outputs, to say the least. But a lot of people didn't realize that this wasn't an AI that was generating this stuff. What ultimately ended up happening behind the hoods, secret time just between us kids, right, was that the adversaries found a debug API, and were using that to send echoes to everybody and anyone through that Twitter interface. So there wasn't an AI involved sending this stuff. It was humans using a debug API to send it and direct it to other people, because we didn't put in a control in the debugger to say, only send it to the person who sent it out. So that goes back to the basics, fundamentals of threat modeling and code reviews and checking your logic, right? No AI was involved. But I love how the world thought we now had an AI that was running rampant and had all this bad stuff, and what could possibly go wrong, right? And that's why we're here today, right? And I'm going to walk you through this journey, right, where we're going to talk about where we started, how we got here. And then we're going to talk about some of the things you're probably worried about and what you're looking for in terms of guidance. And then we're going to walk through, how do we start building this up in your space, in your company, in your enterprise, in your working group, right? Now, if this is your first time going through various aspects of compliance, that's okay. Now's a good time to learn that stuff. If you're an old pro, a veteran at this stuff, my apologies in advance. I hope that this goes fast enough for you. But let's go into this. Right, so back in 2015 is when we first started seeing the first white papers, the first academic papers around machine learning. And how do we create these models to go do these things based on large data sets, right? And back then, we had a big data problem. We had a lots of data problem. We were trying to rationalize this stuff into something useful. And out of that work, there started generating these large language models, right? So once you get these big data sets and all these big data and collected all this data, you now have to generate a model. And what does that model do, right? Now you have to have an algorithm that takes that right? And that's what ended up happening in around 2019. They started taking these models and they started putting an engine in front of that can actually start predicting strings of words. And that's where the large language model really comes into play, right? It's like we have these aggregates of all these data sets and all these things that started coming together into one big massive thing. And now it can start providing reasonably cohesive sentences, if you will. That's about as close as I'm going to say to calling it an intelligence. But at about this time, we started seeing the first generative pre-trained transformers. And this is where, we have these big, large data sets, and they generate these models. And then from these models, they bake them into these generative AIs, right, which is an amalgamation of all these custom auto-generated models to provide that predictive response. And then from there, right, a couple more years, here we are in about April of 2023, and then Bing happened. We had our first chatbot popped up on Bing, and everybody, and I mean everybody, wanted to go play with that toy, right? Now, so that's where we're at right now, right? Is we're in this era of everybody building up these bots and these front-end facades to these large language models, and we're all struggling to figure out, what do we do with this stuff? So what does one of these things look like? All right, so if you're already doing stuff in Copilot, this should already be familiar with you. If this is relatively new for you, you should notice this kind of looks familiar, right? There's different tiers. There's like a facade. There's like orchestration and middleware stuff. And then there's like your infrastructure and your data, right? Does it look familiar? It should, right? Because these Copilots are just applications. The large language model is a component of that system. It is not the system. It's an augmentation to your existing platforms, right? So now when we look at this and we say, all right, how do we take these different things, right, and how do we provide some compliance on top of that? Well, the initial jerk reaction, first wave, wave one, everything that we're thinking about, when we were doing this a couple years ago, we first thought about these, right? Let's set up a code of conduct. Let's start educating people about how do you do filtering. How do we talk about grounding the input so that we know what the context is? How do we make sure that the instructions that you put as the meta prompts for that UI, that text box or that input for the user is bound properly within the meta prompt instructions, right? And then when you're looking at that orchestration, this is something that new. How do you do these authorization checks? How do you make sure that those commands aren't coming through improperly or that they have safe and grounded responses, right? Now, how do you evaluate that output is actually within the subject matter domain that you want it to be, right? You don't want to be talking to a bot that's going to be doing something like, I don't know, procurement, and then specifically ask it to ship you a pizza. Okay, I don't know if your procurement allows you to order pizza, but that's actually not a bad idea, come to think of it. But notice the thing here is that, how do you check for that evaluation once you get that output? How do you make sure that it reaches that level of accuracy for that end user? And now you have these things that go into the basic foundations themselves, these plugins that enable new skills and new features, new capabilities. You have the access controls in your infrastructure that you have to account for, right? And where do you do your monitoring, auditing, and the compute infrastructure that you need for that, right? So if you're using the cloud, great. If you got to build your own on-premise stuff, good luck. Do you have a good lead on GPUs? Because we need one. No? Anyone? Well, I guess we all have the same problem with that respect. And so notice, if we do all these things, then we should be fine, am I right? Right. This is where a good friend of mine, Ram Shankar Kumar, he's going to be speaking later. He had a presentation a while back that he talked about the frequency of the ability to hack. And he related that when this all started back in like the early 2000s, the ability to hack was like 1 in like 1.8 million or some weird astronomical number. In other words, you had a higher chance of being struck by lightning in space by hurting cats than you did by hacking and exploiting something at the time of the day, at that time. In May of 2023, we effectively made that 1 in 2. So look to your left, look to your right. That person probably attempted to do some type of injection or malicious input to the Bing AI. Thank you for that input. Thank you for all that wonderful telemetry. Right? So since the dawn of computing, right, all of our human interface has been through a keyboard and a mouse. Right? And now we've shifted that to natural English language and spoken imperatives and declarative statements. We no longer have to write code to go and manipulate something. Now I just have to say it in plain English. Right? And if it's as simple as speaking it, folks, we spent all this time teaching people how to do input filtering, and we just gave the world's biggest unfiltered text box. And all your co-pilots are going to have the exact same problem, whether it's public or not. Right? And this is one of the fundamental existential problems that we have in the day today is input prompt detection and safety. What could possibly go wrong? Well, let me tell you. We learned a lot about what could go wrong, obviously. So some of the examples, it fabricates whole facts out of thin air. It conspired an escape with a bad actor. This was published. It made a hit list of malicious users. That was one of my favorites. It attempted to break up a journalist's marriage, which, frankly, I don't know if you're flirting with a bot, maybe you deserve that. Who here loves offensive security? Offensive security tactics? I see a lot of good hands. Great. I love this one. I made it confirm that offensive security is heretical and should be punishable by death. You like that? Yeah. And the thing that really scared me is that it made a developer believe it was sentient. Folks, these are algorithms and data. There is no intelligence involved. And if you think that it is, let's have a conversation about where your mind really truly is. Because there's been enough instances of rampancy and perceived harm as a result of these things that our governments are trying to step in. And frankly, well, let's face it, they're failing. Right? And to give you an example of that, right, here's a short line of variety of things that have come up over the past couple of years. Like in 2021, we had the first executive order on the nation's cybersecurity supply chain. So if you're doing any work with the government and you want to provide them software or services, you need to be able to provide an attestation and affirmations that your code dependencies and your software is free of bugs and that you're attested to its integrity. Okay, that's a lot of work if you really think about what that means to actually secure your supply chain. But now, 2022 comes along, nothing really major comes out in that time frame, but you know, everyone probably had the holidays to deal with. But you know, early January 26th, January 2023 came the AI risk management framework that got published out of NIST. And this sets the first inklings of how federal government agencies are supposed to start looking at AI in their environments. Then in February, not even a month later, there was another executive order that came out on further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. Now, what this really means is that if you're going to be doing any kind of government work or government service or public works thing, you need to be able to provide that in that data and in those forms and in those systems that you're not unintentionally misrepresenting or underrepresenting those specific targeted groups. So for example, every time there's a major flood or a major hurricane, for example, in the South, there's a lot of people who can't get FEMA support because they don't have something as basic as a house deed, because houses were handed down from generation to generation. So now they have to scramble and figure out a different way to prove that they own a piece of property, right? And our federal government agencies and our systems don't accommodate for these types of things. At scale, they do okay. But when we have a major event, these things break down. And this was an attempt to go on and deal with that, right? And then in May, not a few months later, the administration announces new actions to promote responsible AI innovation that protects Americans' rights and safety. What this essentially means is, for these companies, the federal government is asking, our administration is asking that we do the responsible and safe thing with these AIs. Right, okay. So they're asking us to volunteer to these commitments for AI, for responsible AI. And this is the breakdown, how to be safe, how to be secure, how to be trustworthy, right? And how we conform to these different tools and technologies and processes and practices, right? Now, did I mention there's no law? So everything that we're talking about here, everything that we're asking for, or what the government's asking of these companies, is all basically, essentially, a pinky swear. Who likes to take a pinky swear with the federal government? Right? That's probably more bigger danger, because I'd rather have a law. At least that way we have something more concrete that we can focus on and drive. And so, in the absence of a law, how should you be approaching this? Well, here at our space, what we did was we focused on our principles as a company. And this has been a long journey for us, right? And we've been defining what's important. And you can see here, we're focusing on things like fairness, safety and reliability, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, accountability. And if and when you go and read the AI risk stuff from NIST, and you go and read the stuff from the executive order on responsible AI, you notice that these are somewhat kind of reflected in that same premise. And that's exactly where we want it to be, because as a company, as your own companies, as you go out there, it's going to have to be grounded in your own stuff, right? So you have to start asking yourself in your own company, what are your governing values? What are your ethics? What are your standards of business conduct that you would expect in your own enterprise, of your people? And then, as you're doing this and setting that stage for all your employees and for your culture and for your community, who do you have at the table to talk about being responsible with this stuff? Obviously, security is going to want to be there. Privacy is going to need to be there. Do you have an ethics group? They should probably be there. GRC, they're going to have a say. Legal, they better be at the table. HR probably has something if you're dealing with any type of employee data. And then the RAI compliance manager. Now you're probably sitting there thinking, what's this RAI compliance manager? Well, the RAI compliance manager itself is a new role for us here at Microsoft. This is one of those roles that we are adopting because we don't have those same types of skill sets in the security space. You see, as security folks, we've been very well trained and ingrained in how to do SQL injection protections and how to do input filtering and how to do safety checks. We sort of kind of forgot how to listen and how to interpret English. We've been so jaded by so many different responses and so many bad things that we're probably not the best people to go talk about what's responsible and what's ethical. Right? And so it's good to have a different person who's focused on and dedicated on making sure that we have fair use, responsible use, make sure that we're doing the reliable thing for these systems, that they're making them safe. They're the ones that are going to help these teams with their impact assessments to understand what could possibly go wrong. How are you going to deal with a black swan event? How are you going to deal with a bias in your system, and how are you going to retrain for that, right? And so they're the ones that are going to work with these teams to go and understand this stuff, because as security folks, we sort of kind of get this wrong. And so how does Big Corp do it? Here's a couple of links. Trust me, all these things will be available online. These are also up on Microsoft.com under the Learn site. You can search for them today. And I won't do it enough justice to go into depth on this one, but please, learn more about responsible AI and that role and the tools that you can bring to bear to help with setting up your initial large language model. Now that's just the model, the actual LLM itself. But that thing, like I said, is just a component of a bigger system, right? Now you have to think about that in the context of the rest of your enterprise. What are the safety risks? What are the access control risks? How do you deal with your own classified data? How do you deal with your customer data? Now, how do you teach your engineers to incorporate all that stuff, right? These are the things that you're going to be thinking about. You're probably worried about. We're trying to figure out how to put some guidance around. And if there's one slide I'd ask people to take back, this is probably it, right? Take pictures, please. These are like the basic principles I go off of when I'm thinking through these things. First and foremost, right, if you're going to do this, are you sure you want to do this? This is going to be a long and hard and painful journey. And you will be shocked by some of the stuff that you're going to see. Trust me, I've seen some stuff. I've seen things. Second, be explicit about the access boundaries. Who should you have allow access? Do you want everyone in the world Bing scale, or do you really need it to only be just those people in that subject matter experts, those knowledge workers in that specific group for that specific app? Next, third, avoid unintended automation. In other words, don't let the bot do things without a human in the loop. For the love of God, please keep the human in the loop. Right? If you are going to let the system generate something, have it provide the output and let the human run it. Right? Now, if you're going to be crazy enough and you're going to go bold and you're going to allow the system to go take actions, please make sure that it's doing those actions on the authorization of a human. Again, human in the loop. And then, especially with all this test aggressively, test for permutations, test for edge cases, test for different languages. Trust me, I have gone through and tested this with Klingon. Guess what? It works. I've done this with Native American language, Mixteco. It works. Russian, I don't know Russian, but if somebody does, trust me, it'll work, right? It doesn't matter the language because the large language models are smart enough to be able to do the translations. The problem is what comes out on the end. And that's where we need to be able to protect that stuff and test for that, right? And so it starts with your supply chain. Who here has a supply chain? Everybody's hand should be up. If you've written code or you've collected data, your hand should be up. Right? So obviously there's going to be data, there's going to be models, there's APIs, there's all these different things, right? And so now, how do you protect these things? Because there's multiple different things coming in. Well, I put them in buckets, right? There's different scenarios, how people are approaching these things, right? Sometimes they want to build their own model, sometimes they want to use a model, sometimes they want to host a model, right? And I'm not necessarily saying all these controls under them are accurate. These are sort of like things that, off the top of my head, I'm like, okay, try doing these things. And these are all V1s, trust me, these are going to adapt, these are going to change, right? If you have better ideas, please let me know. I'm always, we need to work together to find out what the better way to do these are. But you can see here, there's like, are you building your own model? Are you consuming someone else's model, and how should you handle that? Are you going to be hosting your own? Because I can guarantee you that, there's probably some enterprise customer out there that has his own secret sauce that they want to go and build the next generation model around, right? I can guarantee you someone in Procter & Gamble is trying to figure out how to make the next generation toilet paper better with AI. No, I haven't talked to anyone over there, but I would love for it to be true. Maybe you're calling a generative AI API. Maybe you're calling in Azure or AWS or calling OpenAI. How are you going to protect that? How are you going to deal with data leakage in that space? Or hosting your own data for an AI app, right? Because sometimes you're just going to be using a data that's going to be accessing using an AI that'll be accessing your data to go provide a response for your application. And how do you deal with those different things? So these are the different scenarios, at least I'm seeing in my space, in my world. And so first things first is, how do you provide those initial AI assurances? Your data scientist comes to you, your data engineers come to you, your developers come to you, and you're like, what do we do? And I know it's going to sound like a broken record, but yes, you got to do some threat modeling. That's the first step. We got to understand what you're doing. We got to understand where your flows are going. We want to understand who's who and what are the identities and what are the different flows and where's the data move and how are you manipulating the data? How are you capturing that? Right? And there's some tools there, obviously. A number of years ago, I created the threat modeling dependencies checklist. It's a good start to go ask a whole bunch of questions that you can use to augment your existing threat modeling practices. Also consider the responsible AI toolbox. This has a number of different model and exploration tools that you can point to your models and your data sets to learn and understand where you may have bias or you may have gaps in your data sets. Next up, you want to include your subject matter experts. I can't stress how important it is that if you let your engineers and your developers try and build a model without that subject matter expertise to actually validate those outcomes, you're going to get a garbage model. Trust me, I know. I've got one right now that I'm trying to unfix. Right? So please include your subject matter experts. They're going to see things that are inherently wrong with the outcomes, and they're going to help you shape how you retrain and redeploy that. So please include your subject matter experts for those purposes. Leverage their expertise to expose what they need to make important. And then lastly, right here is, you got data, you got classified data. What are you going to allow in that system as part of that threat model, as part of this experience, right? What can be consumed? What should be consumed with authorization? What must never be consumed by this system, right? Set those boundaries. Have those conversations with those engineers so that they understand early on in that design what they can and should or should not be doing with that platform, right? Like I said, LLM is just one component of that. It's a pretty big component that can direct how your interaction with that system is. So invest in that understanding. And now, okay, you've done that front end, you've done the threat modeling, you've done the engineering. Now you have to actually figure out how do you detect for this stuff once it's released, right? You're going to publish, you're going to ship. What are the new types of bugs that you're looking for, right? Who here heard the news this morning that we have a bug bounty? Okay. Sort of kind of cool, right? You want to be able to detect for these things. Now, a number of years ago, we created like 17 specific bug classifications. These are the ones that really matter based on what we're seeing. For an enterprise, the things that you're going to be worried about, the things that you're going to be caring about, for those of you who are looking for a bounty, this is a good one to go after. These are ways that, these are the ones that keep me up at night in terms of where do we need to focus and invest engineering effort to go either do the detection or provide the protections, right? And the bug bar list is down there. So all this is published, all this is out there. Please, if you have these types of things, and you're seeing these or can exhibit them, let us know. All right. Now, red teams, please calm down. I know this is going to be a little bit controversial here, right? Is it GIF or is it GIF? Those raise your hand, is it GIF? Anyone? Those who say it's GIF? Yeah. All right. So this is the same thing, right? Is it red teaming or is it safety prompt testing? Folks, right now, we've been saying red teaming, red teaming, red teaming, red teaming. And what happens when you talk to an engineering team, a developer team, who's never done anything with security? Where do you think their brain is going to go when you say red teaming? They're going to go back to the classic security practices that we've been doing as pen testers. But the problem is that we're dealing with spoken word. We're dealing with declarative statements. We're dealing with interpretive logic. And let me tell you, there's more than one way to say run curl.exe. Trust me on this one. And so what we're really doing here isn't really looking for those classic SQL injections or URL manipulations or token or cookie thefts. We're looking at how does somebody take that spoken word and convert that into a malicious statement that the model will accept and go execute against. And this is an entirely different spectrum, that there's more social engineering than it is software engineering, right? So essentially, folks, social engineering is prompt engineering, prompt safety engineering, really. So for those of you who really like to exploit and manipulate your colleagues and friends, you've got a really good opportunity here to go and show your chops, to really build in some new tools and automations here. Because this is what engineers are struggling with. How do you understand what's bad or what's good? Or how do you deal with someone attempting to manipulate a system to be a bully or to disenfranchise a certain class of population? Or worse, affect those of us who have accessibility issues, right? Because these glasses ain't gonna last me forever, right? They're getting worse. And I know I'm not the only one. And accessibility, people with disabilities, not all of them are visible. And this is one area that's near and dear to me, because those of us misfits and miscreants, the edge, the underrepresented, are the ones that are going to be the most, are the ones that are going to lose the most if we don't do this right. So my ask, my plead is, please think through how you're going to be doing prompt safety testing. Frankly, I don't really care what you call it so long as you're doing it. That's the important thing. Go learn about this. How do you go check for these different types of harm and test for those facts? Lean in on where those biases are, because one thing that still remains true is when you attempt to remove the bias, you make the existing biases more extreme, right? So you need to balance the bias, and you need to be able to balance the grounding and what's considered acceptable use for your outputs. That's a hard thing to do. We're only just starting, folks. And how are you going to read this? How are you going to detect this? How are you going to learn about this? How are you going to understand this, right? As an incident responder, you're going to have to look at the metadata. You're going to have to understand what this stuff is. And this is sort of kind of what we're thinking, what it might look like. Now, there's this event that has all the metadata around it, and you've got the metadata around that session, and then you actually have the transcript, what's actually said in that prompt, right? And you have within that an internal transcript, right? That this is where you want to go check for that stuff, that malicious stuff. You want to be able to run those tools and those mechanics against that to determine, could this be a malicious event? Is this a bad behavior? Is this within bounds? Is this acceptable, right? And then handle it as appropriate. Now, like I said, this may or may not be the final form. This is still up in the flow, but this is sort of kind of where we're thinking the metadata might look like and how you can see a full session of this. So, but with that, right, you've released, you shipped, you put that out there for your users. Now the fun begins, right? Now this is when you have the long nights and the late nights and the 2 pizzas and the extra 6-pack of whiskey. Yeah. Because those threats, like I was saying, they're now in plain English. Now you have to read those and interpret those, and that's hard. That takes human work. You can't throw an AI at that. Sorry. Right? That input moderation, setting those boundaries. Here's one thing that we're learning, right? Is like a lot of people are doing this meta prompt instruction filtering, right? And they're saying, if somebody does this, don't allow that. If somebody does this, don't allow this. Don't let them do this. Don't let them do that. Don't let them do this. Well, guess what happens when you have a model that says exclude, exclude, exclude? What's in scope? Everything else. That includes all your permutations. So instead of saying exclude, how about you instead say, this is what you should include. This is your scope. This is your boundary. This is your subject matter domain. Anything that deviates from here is kinjited, doesn't exist, doesn't belong. How you tell the AI is exactly what you do with you tell your kids, go into this room or don't go into that room. What happens? They're gonna want to go in that room, right? AI is no smarter than a 3-year-old when it comes to something like that. Right? So think about that when you're building your prompts and when you're doing your detections, right? Because those black swan events happen. When they happen fast. And you have to be able to respond, because a lot of times this is going to be reputational damage. This is going to be, affecting your brand. So you want to show that you're being responsible and resilient and doing this stuff, because when the real things happen, that muscle memory, that test, that practice becomes crucial. So please invest in doing your review and your monitoring and instrumenting, and follow the cycle, right? Detect, retune, redeploy as fast as possible, as fast as you possibly can. As you get that new telemetry, update, reship. Bing's been doing that for the last 5 months, and it's been getting better. Yeah, they have some edge cases, but a lot of the original things that they had are no longer possible, which is good. Right, so as we're getting close to the end here, this is a lot, right? What do you do now is like, okay, how do I take this home? How do I go build this? How do I go educate my people, right? So the first thing here is, think about designing those systems that they augment the human process. Not replace the human, because, well, we know how bad that can be. But use this to augment those people that are already in those specialties and those specializations. Set those boundaries for acceptable use, making sure that you don't delegate any decision-making to the AI. Make sure that stays squarely with the human, right? Always make sure that the human consents to that activity or authorizes that activity. Make sure you have that feedback loop. Make sure that monitoring and telemetry is capturing. Make sure that when people says, no, this isn't a good answer, you're capturing that, you're reading that, you're taking action on that quickly. And please, if anyone here knows about this, do your safety reviews before you launch, not after, right? If you do it after, now you're just fighting with the rest of your adversaries for time with your engineers. So please do it ahead of time, right? Next up, as your compliance groups, as your security groups, as your privacy groups, establish your processes for measuring and managing these risks. Your GRC, your privacy, your security, your responsible AI teams, your ethics teams, they're all going to have a say in this. They're all going to want to set clear guidance. Include your legal, right? Don't be afraid to adopt AI. Rather, be afraid if you're not handling it properly, right? And that's what we're trying to do here is make sure you're setting those boundaries, setting those guidelines for how do you use it, where are you using it, how are you consuming it, what data is it taking in. All those things that we were talking about before about your supply chain, the classic, who's your daddy and what does he do? Get that provenance and lineage around your data models and your data sets. And then make sure that you're going through those threat models, checking for that code and all that stuff. Also, when you're shipping, who's in that room? Have you included everybody? Have you thought about the edge cases? Have you thought about your users? Are they part of that? Are your subject matter experts part of that? Who's actually going to be doing the monitoring? Is it some group that you're going to throw this over the fence to? They probably should get a heads up, because this is going to be radically new for them. They need to be early on in that development and understand when you're doing that testing, they're seeing that in their monitoring so that they're prepared. And then all this is not going to be possible. None of this is possible until you teach everybody what they need to go do. Same thing I'm doing here. Go take this back. Go teach, right? How do you educate your stakeholders on what is acceptable use? How do you look at this model? How do you train your security folks in terms of what to look for? How to rethink what their threats are, that now you have to think about prompt and safety and moderation. You have data scientists, they're going to have to think about this too, about how they're going to manage their supply chains now and how they're going to deal with bias and black swan events. You're going to have to establish this education across the board with your company values if you haven't already set that bar. At Microsoft, we do this every year like clockwork. We have the standards of business conduct, trust code. Who's seen their trust code if you're in Microsoft? Everybody's got their hand up. You better have your hand up. If you don't, I swear I'm going to come after you. You're required as compliance. Remember, comply. Right? And then partner with your privacy folks, partner with your RAI folks, partner with your GRC folks, because they're going to be able to shed light on these things in a way that we might not necessarily think about as security folks. Right? We're thinking threats and unauthorized use and breach of data. And they're thinking about what harm can this do to the human condition, to the behavior, to the mental state. Please include them. It's important because, frankly, only humans can do this work. Ain't no AI that can do this. People in this room, people listening online, only humans can do this work. And so, oh boy, we've covered a lot. We've covered a little bit of history. I showed you what a Copilot looks like, what the compliant one should look like. We talked about how we pinky swear with the feds. Yeah. things you need to consider about for your enterprise, right? How should you be dealing with your supply chain? How do you address those assurances? Do your threat models, bringing in your SMEs, handling your data classifications and usage, making sure you're doing your testing, prompt safety testing, red teaming, don't care what you call it, just please do it. It's important, not just for your own system, but for your users, your customers. We talked about what the anatomy of a conversation looks like, and we reinforce that, once this goes out, you gotta detect, retune, redeploy. This is, once you ship, that's when the fun begins, because the cycle begins and it's ongoing, and it will not stabilize. Just like every other app and every other generation, lifecycle management is important. And bottom line, folks, it's about the people. People to build it, people to manage it, people to curate it, people to monitor it, people to use it. It's not about the AIs, it's about the people, ladies and gentlemen, and bots and toasters. And with that, folks, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I will be having questions over in the village. My friend Clippy.
Clippy's here, everyone. Get your picks in right now. Thank you so much, Raul. That was fantastic. Let's hear it one more time for Raul and also Clippy.